Diversity pay gaps are discussed at length, but not enough people talk about the cause. Keep listening to hear me explain a major cause of diversity pay gaps. I'm Dr. Jonathan Ashong-Lamptey. I work with people leaders to design inclusive organizations, and I'm on a mission to help 1 million people like you to make your workplace inclusive. Get your pen and paper ready because I'm going to highlight 2 major causes of diversity pay gaps. Now, this is important because despite all of the talk, not enough is said about how diversity pay gaps actually happen. So what I'm about to say is going to give you a clue about how they actually show up in the workplace. And I'm going to do this by talking about occupational segregation. When I was a PhD student, I was interviewed by the LSE for their YouTube channel. In the video, I was talking about some of the challenges that surrounded the experiences of ethnic minorities in the workplace. I talked about the ethnic penalty, which is the unexplained gap that exists when you take into account age, location, and everything else that you can think of that would explain why one person would be paid more than another. The ethnic penalty reveals that depending on your ethnic group, the size of this unexplained gap increases. So for example, Chinese people and Indian people, the gap is pretty small. But for people who are Black African, Black Caribbean, Pakistani or Bangladeshi, well, that gap is pretty large when compared to their white counterparts. So if you took that literally, you might think that a white person and let's say a Pakistani person will be paid different amounts of money for doing the same job. And that's not necessarily true. A large part of this gap, and in fact, a large part of any demographic pay gap, can be explained by occupational segregation. And I'm going to talk about 2 ways that this shows up. But let's continue to talk about ethnicity. Occupational segregation suggests that people of different ethnicities can be found in different occupations. Now, these occupations have got different rates of pay. So it's not so much that individuals are getting paid different amounts within the same occupation. No, and I'm not denying that that happens. But what I am saying is there are massive differences between occupations. So let's look at a practical example of what I mean. In my show, The 2 Sides of Diversity That No One Has Told You About, Dr. Richard Norrie talks about his research where he found that Pakistanis were overrepresented as pharmacists. Black Africans were overrepresented as security guards and social workers. Indians were overrepresented as dentists and IT professionals. Now, I'm picking these out just to make a point, but can you see that these occupations have got different rates of pay? Now, it's a bit rough and ready, I know, but can you see the point I'm making here? These are examples of horizontal occupational segregation. Different ethnic groups clustered around different jobs. So that's the horizontal one. What about vertical occupational segregation? Well, you've probably come across this and didn't even realize it. As a regular listener to the show, you'll have heard me talk about gender pay reporting. In the UK, organisations with more than 250 employees, they're required to publish differences in the average pay for men and women. Now, pretty much everyone who reports this has a difference and it needs to be explained. And I regularly point out that pretty much everyone gives the same explanation. And that explanation is that women are underrepresented at senior level. This underrepresentation is an example of vertical occupational segregation. The segregation takes place within a hierarchy. Now imagine what happens when we combine the effects of horizontal and vertical. You're going to get groups that are overrepresented at both ends of the spectrum. At one end, you're going to get groups that are overrepresented at the top of organizations in very high, well-paid occupations. And then on the flip side, we're going to have groups that are overrepresented at the bottom of the pyramid, at the bottom of organizations. And guess what? They're not going to be very well paid. Can you see how difficult it would be to address that? So let's talk about the elephant in the room. When I've been using the term segregation, what have you been thinking? What comes to mind? I can tell you what I think. I think of words like apartheid, Jim Crow. I think of structural disadvantage, inequality that's built into the system, institutions and practices that produce and reproduce inequality. Now, this is all starting to sound a little heavy, isn't it? And it's supposed to. These pay gaps are real. The more data we get, the more we're going to see that it points towards these deep-rooted issues. Now, some will argue that these differences are caused by free will, people choosing some occupations over others, people choosing not to progress within a hierarchy. Well, what do you think about that? What's important is why these things are happening and what does it look like in your organization. Until we discover that, we're not going to be able to fix it. So let's wrap this up. What are the key messages here? Occupational segregation is all around us, and it explains our reality because 1, the horizontal version points towards differences between occupations, and 2, the vertical version points towards differences within a hierarchy, and then 3, both point towards systematic disadvantage. So what do you think? Have you ever seen occupational segregation in real life? Get in touch or leave a message. I would love to hear from you. I'd also like to get some feedback on these shorter shows. What I'm trying to do now is make some of these shows really short, really punchy. I'm just experimenting with the formats. Let me know what you think. I'm also making short little teaser videos that I'm putting on LinkedIn and maybe I'm going to put on Twitter and other forms of social media. Do you like these? Do you dislike these? Give me some feedback so I can get you more of what you like. If you've learned something from today's show, you should sign up to our insider list on our website. It's free and you can stay ahead of the pack and get the best of everything that I produce. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode.